call that shattered my Thursday afternoon came not from a lawyer or a distant relative, but from a hospital in rural Virginia, a place I'd never heard of, in a county whose name I had to ask the nurse to repeat twice. Marcus Webb had listed me as his emergency contact, which seemed impossible given that I hadn't seen him in nearly 8 years, not since we graduated from the same software engineering program and gone our separate ways into the tech industry. The nurse's voice carried a tremor that professional training couldn't quite suppress when she told me I needed to come immediately. That Marcus was asking for me specifically, that time was critical. I made the 4-hour drive from my Baltimore apartment in just over 3, my mind racing through possibilities and memories of my old friend. Marcus had been brilliant, the kind of person who could code for 18 hours straight and still emerge with elegant solutions to problems that had stumped entire teams. But he'd also been restless, dissatisfied with the corporate trajectory that the rest of us had embraced, and he'd dropped out of sight about 5 years ago. I'd assumed he'd gone to work for some startup or moved to Silicon Valley. I'd never imagined I'd be racing to a rural hospital to see him dying. When I finally reached his room, nothing could have prepared me for what I found. Marcus lay in the bed, his body swathed in bandages that couldn't quite hide the extent of his injuries, and what skin remained visible was a horror of burns. Not the kind from fire or chemicals, but something else entirely. The flesh looked blackened and cracked, as though it had been subjected to intense heat that had also done something fundamentally wrong to it, leaving patterns that almost resembled symbols or writing in the charred tissue. His eyes, when they found mine, carried a desperation that transcended physical pain. "David," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The nurse had stepped out to give us privacy, though I suspected she was grateful for the excuse to leave the room. "You came. Thank God you came." I pulled a chair close to the bed, trying not to let my shock show on my face. "Jesus, Marcus, what happened to you?" "The farm," he whispered, and something in those 2 words made my skin prickle. "I bought a farm, thought I could escape the city, live simply, get away from all the noise. Found this place in West Virginia, 40 acres with a house and barn, seemed perfect." He coughed, a wet, painful sound. "I was there for 3 months before I realized something was wrong, before I understood what I'd really bought." "Marcus, the doctors can't help me," he interrupted, with a vehemence that sparked briefly in his dying eyes. "This isn't something medicine understands. I broke the rules, David. I thought I was smarter than superstition, thought I could rationalize everything. I was wrong." His hand, wrapped in gauze, reached toward me with visible effort. "I need you to take the farm. I need you to be the keeper." "What are you talking about? I don't want a farm. I'm a software developer in Baltimore." "It doesn't matter what you want," Marcus said, and now there was an edge of something like anger in his voice, or perhaps it was just urgency given shape by desperation. "The land needs a keeper. Without one, what's contained there will break free. I've seen it, David. I've seen what happens when the rules aren't followed, when the guard lapses even for a moment. It burned me because I failed, because I tried to leave without finding a replacement." He coughed again, and this time blood flecked his lips. "You're the only person I know who's smart enough to learn the rules and stubborn enough to follow them, even when everything in you screams to run." I wanted to tell him he was delirious, that the pain and trauma had unhinged his mind, but the look in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't madness speaking. It was terrible lucid knowledge. "If I refuse," I asked quietly, "then thousands die, maybe tens of thousands." Marcus's hand found mine, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. "The thing on that land has been bound for over a century, but the binding requires a keeper, someone to maintain the rules, to speak the words, to make the offerings. I failed, and it's already stirring. Without a new keeper, the binding will collapse completely within days. Please, David." I wouldn't ask if there was any other choice. The monitors beside his bed began to alarm, and nurses rushed in. Marcus's grip tightened one final time, his eyes locked on mine. "The deed is in my truck, parking lot, blue Ford, keys in my jacket pocket here. Go tonight. Don't wait. The longer the land stands empty, the weaker the binding becomes. His voice dropped to a whisper I had to lean close to hear. And whatever you do, don't let the harvester take corporeal form. Don't let it build its body from the chaff. Then, the nurses were pushing me aside. Doctors were rushing in, and I stood in the hallway while they tried to save a man I could see was already beyond saving. Marcus Webb died at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in October. His body consumed by burns that the official report would eventually, impossibly, attribute to spontaneous combustion. I found his truck in the parking lot just as he'd said. The keys were in his jacket pocket, along with a wallet containing his license, $347 in cash, and a photograph that made my breath catch. It showed Marcus standing in front of an old white farmhouse, smiling, looking healthy and hopeful. On the back, in his handwriting, "Day 1 at Ashford Farm. New life begins." The photograph was dated 5 months ago. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had reduced a healthy 34-year-old man to a burned husk begging for release, had occurred in less than half a year. The deed was in the glove compartment, along with something else. A leather journal, worn and stained, filled with Marcus's handwriting. The first entry was dated shortly after the photograph. May 3rd. Moved into Ashford Farm today. Previous owner was an old woman named Alice Ashford. Last of her line. She seemed relieved to sell, almost desperate, though the land is beautiful and the house is solid. Asked me if I was prepared for the responsibility. Thought she meant the upkeep. Now, I'm not so sure. I sat in Marcus's truck, the keys heavy in my hand, reading by the dome light as the October darkness deepened around me. The journal chronicled Marcus's gradual discovery of something wrong with his new property, a wrongness that had started subtle and grown increasingly impossible to ignore. May 7th. Found rules carved into the gatepost. Thought they were just folk wisdom at first, the kind of superstitious nonsense rural people cling to. Now I'm wondering, the rules are specific, too specific. They read like warnings. The next pages contained a list, carefully transcribed in Marcus's neat handwriting. The Ashford binding rules for the keeper. Rule 1. Never enter the cornfield after sunset. The paths change in the dark, and what walks between the rows is not bound by the same rules that govern the house and barn. Rule 2. Keep the scarecrow's post maintained and painted with salt. If the post falls or the salt washes away, something will take its place. Rule 3. The barn's east door must remain sealed from the autumn equinox until the spring equinox. What sleeps in the loft during these months must not be disturbed. Rule 4. Burn offerings of grain and tobacco at the stone circle every new moon. The offerings must be given willingly, not grudgingly, or they will be rejected and something else will be taken instead. Rule 5. If you hear singing from the well, do not look into it. Do not draw water from it for 3 days. Do not acknowledge that you heard anything. Rule 6. Never speak the name Ashford aloud between midnight and 3 a.m. The old bloodline still has power here, even in death, and names called in the dead hours draw attention from things that should remain unnoticed. Rule 7. If the crops in the cornfield form a circle, burn it immediately before the next sunrise. The pattern is not natural, and what it summons grows stronger with each hour it remains. Rule 8. The boundary stones around the property must never be moved or removed. They are not markers. They are anchors. Rule 9. If you see a figure in the cornfield carrying a burning scythe, do not run. Do not engage. Return to the house immediately, lock all doors, and wait for dawn. Cannot enter the house unless invited. Rule 10. You may leave the property, but you must never abandon it entirely. The land requires a keeper. If you wish to leave permanently, you must find a willing replacement first. If you try to leave without one, the harvester will come for you, and his flames burn in ways that no water can extinguish. I stared at that last rule, understanding flooding through me with nauseating clarity. Marcus had tried to leave. He'd probably reached his breaking point, decided that no property was worth the psychological weight of these rules, and he'd simply driven away thinking he'd call a real estate agent and sell the place remotely. And something had come after him, something that burned with fire, that transcribed symbols into flesh, that consumed him slowly enough that he'd made it to a hospital, but thoroughly enough that medicine couldn't help him. The journal continued, and I read it all there in the parking lot, unable to stop even as each entry made me want more desperately to throw the keys away and pretend this conversation had never happened. Marcus documented encounters with things that shouldn't exist, movements in the cornfield that created patterns too regular to be natural, the sound of footsteps circling the house at night, occasions when he'd wake to find symbols drawn in ash on the outside of his windows. He'd researched the property's history at the county records office and discovered that Ashford Farm had been in the same family since 1847, when Silas Ashford had first claimed the land. The Ashfords had always been odd, keeping to themselves, following strange practices that neighbors whispered about but never questioned directly. August 3rd, finally found records of what Silas Ashford did when he first came to this land. He was a minister who'd been defrocked for unorthodox practices. He talks about finding a place where the armies of hell press close against the world. He believed something demonic had claimed this land, using it as a beachhead for an invasion. He spent years developing a binding, a ritual to contain it. The Ashford bloodline has maintained that binding for 7 generations. August 10th. Alice Ashford was the last of her line. No children, no siblings, both parents dead. When she sold me the farm, she was effectively breaking a century-and-a-half chain of keepers. She looked relieved when I signed the papers, but also guilty. She tried to explain the rules to me, tried to make me understand the responsibility. I thought she was just an eccentric old woman. God, I was such a fool. August 17th. The harvester appeared again tonight, closer this time. It stood at the edge of the cornfield, maybe 30 yards from the house, and it spoke. It told me what it is. A demon that has been bound to this land since before Silas Ashford arrived, imprisoned by rituals that chain it to the role of harvester, condemning it to walk eternally through fields. It hates the binding, it hates the Ashfords, and now it knows I'm not an Ashford, that the bloodline is broken, and it's testing the strength of the binding every single night. September 1st. I can't do this anymore. Every night is worse. This isn't life. It's a prison sentence. I'm going to leave. I'll list the property. Let someone else deal with this. Maybe if there's no keeper at all, whatever's here will just disperse. Maybe the binding will hold on its own. The next entry was dated a week later, written in a shaky hand. September 8th. I tried to leave yesterday. Made it about 40 miles before the truck started smelling like smoke. Then the pain started. At first, I thought it was a heart attack, but it kept getting worse, spreading from my chest outward. My shirt was smoking. My skin underneath was black, marked with symbols I recognized from the stone circle. I drove back to the farm, and when I crossed the property line, the pain stopped. I understand now. The binding doesn't just contain the demon. It binds the keeper to the land as well. You cannot leave without a replacement. The binding will kill you if you try. The final entries were desperate, increasingly illegible as Marcus's condition worsened. September 15th. The burns are getting worse even though I'm staying on the property. I think I damaged the binding when I tried to leave. The harvester knows I'm weakening. It comes closer every night. It's waiting. When I die, it goes free. September 20th. Found Alice Ashford's phone number in the county records and called her. She cried when she heard my voice, said she'd hoped I would be stronger than she was. She told me how to find a replacement, but they must accept freely and with full knowledge. She gave me your name, David. Said she'd had a vision of you, that you were meant for this. September 23rd. I'm dying. The burns cover 70% of my body now. I can barely move, but I managed to drive to the hospital. Used your name as my emergency contact. I'm sorry, David. So sorry. But you're the only one who can do this. Go to the farm. Read everything. Then make your choice. But know that if you refuse, the harvester will be free within days, and its burning harvest will spread far beyond this property. I sat in that truck for over an hour, rereading Marcus's journal, my hands shaking. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that demons and supernatural keepers couldn't be real. But Marcus was dead, burned in ways that no natural fire could achieve, marked with symbols that his journal documented as part of the binding ritual. And he'd known his death was coming, had predicted it in entries written days before it happened. The rational explanations crumbled under the weight of evidence I was holding. If he was telling the truth, I now had a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. I could refuse, drive back to Baltimore, return to my comfortable life of code and urban anonymity. And in a few days, maybe a week, something that had been bound for over a century would break free. Marcus believed it would kill thousands. Or I could drive to West Virginia, to a farm I'd never seen, and take on responsibility for maintaining a supernatural binding using rules and rituals I barely understood. I would become the keeper of a prison that held something demonic. I would give up my life, my career, my future, to stand guard over something that wanted nothing more than to burn me as it had burned Marcus. The decision should have been easy. Self-preservation is the most fundamental human instinct. But I kept thinking about a number, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Marcus had said it with complete conviction. And if he was right, if my refusal led to even a fraction of that carnage, could I live with that knowledge? The answer, I discovered, was no. I started Marcus's truck and pulled up the farm's address on my phone. 2 hours west, deep into West Virginia coal country, in a region where GPS became unreliable and road signs were sparse. The drive took me deeper into darkness with every mile. Baltimore's lights faded behind me, replaced by the occasional small town and long stretches of forest-lined highway. I crossed the Virginia border, then pushed further west into terrain that seemed to resist modern civilization. Around 11:30, my GPS announced I'd reached my destination, though I saw nothing but dark forest on both sides of the road. Then my headlights caught it. A gap in the trees and a gate. Not some rustic wooden thing, but a proper metal gate with a chain and padlock. And beyond it, a gravel road leading into deeper darkness. A post beside the gate bore a faded sign, Ashford Farm, private property. I got out, keys in hand, and found the one that fit the padlock. As I worked the mechanism, my flashlight caught the carvings on the gatepost, and I realized these were the rules Marcus had transcribed. They'd been carved deep into the wood, probably over many years, added to and refined by generations of Ashfords. Some were weathered almost to illegibility, while others looked relatively fresh, perhaps added by Alice before she'd fled her responsibility. The gate swung open with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the night silence, and I drove through, leaving it open behind me. I might need to make a quick exit if this turned out to be more than I could handle. The gravel road wound through dense forest for perhaps half a mile before opening into fields that stretched away into darkness on both sides. And there, illuminated by my headlights, stood the farmhouse from Marcus's photograph. It was a classic 2-story farmhouse, white clapboard siding that looked gray in the darkness, a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides, windows dark and empty like unseeing eyes. Behind it, I could make out the bulk of a barn, and the rustling presence of what must be the cornfield Marcus had written about so obsessively. The whole scene would have been picturesque in daylight, the kind of pastoral American image that real estate agents dream about. At midnight, with October wind moving through unseen crops and forest pressing close on all sides, it looked like the setting for every horror story I'd ever read. I parked near the house and sat in the truck with the engine running, studying the property through the windshield. Nothing moved in the visible areas. No lights showed in the house or barn. Everything appeared perfectly normal, perfectly abandoned, exactly what you'd expect of a property whose owner had died in a hospital 2 hours away. Then I saw it. Movement in the cornfield, perhaps 100 yards from the house. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the stalks, but the motion was wrong. Too regular, too purposeful. Something tall was moving through the corn, and as I watched, it emerged into the open space between the field and the barn. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, its proportions all wrong in ways my brain struggled to process. It wore what looked like a tattered coat made from burlap, and where its head should have been, I saw only a rough sack with holes that glowed with internal fire. In its elongated hands, it carried a scythe. The blade burned with flames that didn't flicker or waver, a steady orange-red glow that cast dancing shadows across the ground. The Harvester, the demon that Marcus had written about, the thing that Silas Ashford had bound to this land nearly 2 centuries ago. It stood there watching the house, or more specifically, watching my truck. And even though I was separated from it by glass and a good 75 yards of distance, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical thing. This was ancient intelligent malevolence, focused directly on me. Rule 9 echoed in my memory. If you see a figure in the cornfield carrying a burning scythe, do not run. Do not engage. Return to the house immediately, lock all doors, and wait for dawn. Every instinct screamed at me to start the engine and floor it, to get away from this place and never look back. But Marcus's burns were still fresh in my mind, and I understood now what happened to keepers who tried to flee. The Harvester remained motionless as I walked to the house, its burning scythe casting my shadow long and distorted across the ground. Only when I was inside with the door locked behind me did I dare look out the window. The Harvester had moved closer. It now stood perhaps 30 yards from the house, in the space between the barn and the porch. In the darkness, its burning scythe was the only clear thing I could see, a blade of fire hovering at the edge of perception. I checked every door and window in the house, confirming they were all locked and sealed. The house was as Marcus had left it. Dishes in the sink, his laptop on the kitchen table, clothes in the bedroom hamper. The place smelled of dust and abandonment, but underneath that was something else. Smoke and scorched earth, as if the very walls had absorbed the scent of the Harvester's fires. I made myself coffee, needing the ritual of normal activity to ground myself against the impossibility of my situation. Through the kitchen window, I could still see the glow of the burning scythe, moving slowly, pacing back and forth like a prisoner testing the strength of his cage. Marcus's laptop was password protected, but I found a notebook beside it with login credentials. The desktop held folders of research, county records, historical documents, photographs of the stone circle and boundary markers, scans of old letters and journals from previous keepers. I spent the hours until dawn reading, learning the full scope of what I'd inherited. Silas Ashford had come to this land in 1847, fresh from being expelled from his ministry for practicing what his superiors called dangerous theology. He'd been searching for places where, as he wrote, the barrier between God's ordered world and the chaos of hell grew thin. He found such a place in what would become Ashford Farm, a 40-acre plot where previous settlers had refused to build, where even animals seemed to avoid. Silas spent months studying the location, mapping what he called telluric currents and demon traces. He concluded that something had claimed this land long before humans arrived, something that existed partially in our world and partially in what he termed the burning realms, domains of pure fire and suffering. The entity called itself by a name that Silas wrote only in cipher, but he described it as a demon of harvest and flame, condemned by higher powers to reap but never gather. It had been bound to this place by forces Silas didn't fully understand, perhaps by the very nature of the location itself. But its binding was weak, incomplete. It could manifest partially, could reach out in limited ways, but couldn't leave or fully materialize without help. Silas's great work was to reinforce that binding, to turn the demon's prison from a leaky cage into something more secure. He developed rituals based on what he learned from his research into apocryphal texts, and what the demon itself inadvertently revealed. The binding he created was complex, layered, requiring constant maintenance. And crucially, it required a keeper, a human anchor who would take on the responsibility of maintaining the rituals and paying the price for the demon's containment. The price was steep. The keeper was bound to the land almost as tightly as the demon itself. They could leave temporarily, but never permanently without finding a replacement. The binding would actively punish attempts at abandonment, burning the keeper with the same flames the demon wielded, until they returned or died. Over 7 generations, the Ashford family had paid this price, each generation teaching the next the rules and rituals necessary to maintain the binding. Until Alice, who had no children to pass the burden to, and who finally couldn't endure anymore. She'd found Marcus, sweet-talked him into buying the property, tried to explain the responsibility, and then fled. The binding had accepted Marcus as keeper because he'd bought the land willingly, even if he didn't understand what he was really accepting. And now it had accepted me, because Marcus had passed me the deed and I'd come willingly to the property. I was bound now. The moment I'd crossed the property line with Marcus's keys in my pocket and the deed in his truck, I'd become the keeper. The binding had transferred to me, and the harvester knew it. That's why it had appeared immediately, why it was pacing outside the house. It was testing me, evaluating its new jailer. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening incrementally until I could see the harvester in full detail through the windows. In daylight, it looked even less human. A construct of corn chaff and burlap, bound into roughly humanoid shape, with the burning scythe still glowing in its oversized hands. As the sun cleared the horizon, the figure began to diminish, becoming less substantial until it was gone entirely. Only a scorched circle on the ground marked where it had stood. I stepped out onto the porch and surveyed my new domain. The farmhouse was solid but needed maintenance. Peeling paint, loose boards on the porch, windows that didn't sit quite straight in their frames. The barn was in better shape, its red paint faded but intact. Beyond them, the cornfield stretched for acres, the stalks brown and dry in late October, ready for harvest. My phone buzzed, the last gasp of battery life and cellular signal this far into the wilderness. A text from my boss. "Where are you? You missed the morning stand-up." I stared at the message, thinking about my apartment in Baltimore, my job, the life I'd been living just 24 hours ago. All of it suddenly felt impossibly distant, part of a different world that I could no longer access. I typed out a reply, family emergency. Need to take extended leave. Will explain later. Then I turned off the phone, knowing I wouldn't turn it on again for a long time, if ever. There was work to do. The journal entries made clear that the binding required constant attention. The first new moon was in 3 days, which meant I needed to prepare offerings for the stone circle. The scarecrow post that Marcus had mentioned was visible from the porch, standing in the middle of the cornfield. I would need to check it, ensure the salt was still effective. The boundary stones needed to be walked and verified. And I needed to learn the words, the specific phrases that Silas had developed to reinforce the binding. I found the scarecrow post exactly where Marcus's maps indicated, in the geometric center of the cornfield. The post itself was oak, ancient and weathered, sunk deep into the ground. Carved into it were symbols that matched those in Silas's journals. Binding sigils meant to anchor and contain. I spent the afternoon carefully applying fresh salt, mixing it with water to create a paste that would dry hard and weatherproof. As I worked, I felt watched. The cornfield was empty. I could see clearly between the rows in all directions, but the sensation persisted. A prickling on the back of my neck, a certainty that something was observing my every movement. That night, I prepared for the second test. I'd survived my first encounter with the harvester by following Rule 9. But there were other rules, other dangers that the journals documented. The barn's east door, for instance, was currently sealed with iron bars and chains. Rule 3 stated it must remain so until spring. Marcus's notes explained why. Whatever sleeps in the barn loft during winter is not the harvester but something else. Something that has been drawn to the binding's energy. Previous keepers have documented it as a presence that feeds on heat and life. If disturbed, it emerges and drains warmth from everything it touches. The Ashfords learned this the hard way in 1889, when young Thomas Ashford opened the east door in January. They found him frozen solid, drained of heat, despite temperatures well above freezing. I made certain the barn's east door remained sealed, checking the chains twice before I returned to the house for the night. As darkness fell, I stood on the porch and watched the cornfield, waiting to see if the harvester would appear again. It did, materializing gradually from the shadows between the corn stalks. Tonight, it stood further away, but its burning scythe was clearly visible, painting the night in shades of orange and red. We regarded each other across the distance. Man and demon, jailer and prisoner, bound together by rituals neither of us had chosen. "I'm here," I said aloud, though I doubted it could hear me at this distance. "I'm the new keeper. I'll maintain the binding. You stay contained, and I'll follow the rules. That's how this works." The figure remained motionless for a long moment. Then it raised the burning scythe in what might have been acknowledgement or threat. Either way, the message was clear. Our relationship had been established. It would test me, probe for weaknesses, wait for the inevitable moment when I faltered. And I would resist, maintaining the rituals and rules that kept it imprisoned. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was equal parts mundane farm work and supernatural maintenance. I repaired the house, fixed the porch boards, replaced broken windows. I walked the property boundary every morning, checking the stones that marked its limits, each one a crucial anchor point for the rituals. I harvested the corn, working long days to bring in the crop before winter, always careful to never enter the field after sunset, when the paths changed and something else walked between the rows. The new moon came on my 6th day, and I performed my first offering at the stone circle. The circle stood in a clearing behind the barn, 12 standing stones arranged in perfect symmetry, with a central fire pit that had been used for this purpose for nearly 2 centuries. I followed Silas's instructions precisely, burning wheat and tobacco while speaking the words he'd recorded. A mixture of Latin, what might have been Hebrew, and syllables that belonged to no language I recognized. The flames turned blue, just as Marcus had described, and in that blue fire, I saw something. Impressions, images, fragments of knowledge that couldn't be expressed in words. I understood in that moment the true scope of what was bound here. The harvester was not merely a demon in the Christian sense, not simply an evil spirit. It was something older, something that had existed before human concepts of good and evil, a force of nature given malevolent consciousness. It had been here when the first humans crossed into this continent, had watched civilizations rise and fall, had fed on the fear and suffering of countless generations. And it would be here long after humanity was dust, if the binding ever failed. The weight of that knowledge nearly crushed me. I was merely the latest in a long line of keepers, and there would need to be others after me. This was not a burden that could be resolved, only endured. 3 weeks into my tenure as keeper, I had my first major test. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of singing, beautiful haunting voices rising from somewhere outside. At first, in my sleep-fogged state, I thought it was a radio or perhaps neighbors, though the nearest occupied property was 5 miles away. Then I remembered Rule 5. If you hear singing from the well, do not look into it. Do not draw water from it for 3 days. Do not acknowledge that you heard anything. The well stood between the house and the barn, an old stone structure with a wooden cover and a bucket on a rope. The singing emanated from it clearly now, multiple voices in harmony, singing in that same unknown language I'd heard in my mind during the offering ritual. The melody was achingly beautiful, promising revelations and truths, calling me to come and witness wonders. I forced myself to remain in bed, to pull the pillow over my head, to wait out the compulsion. But the singing persisted, growing louder and more insistent, until it felt like the voices were inside my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. The promise in that song was intoxicating. Knowledge, power, freedom from the burden I'd accepted. All I had to do was just look into the well and see what lay at the bottom. My body moved without conscious direction, and I found myself standing at the window, overlooking the well, my hand on the latch. The singing intensified, triumphant, welcoming. And in that moment, I understood what would happen if I went to the well. I would look into it, see something down there in the darkness, something that would show me truths I wasn't meant to comprehend. And like Billy Garrett in Marcus's journal, like probably dozens of other keepers who'd broken this rule over the centuries, my mind would shatter under the weight of that knowledge. I yanked my hand away from the window latch and stumbled back to bed, where I spent the remaining hours until dawn with my hands clamped over my ears, humming loudly to drown out the siren song from the well. By sunrise, the singing had stopped, and when I cautiously approached the well, the water I could see far below was black and viscous, confirming that I'd made the right choice by not looking, not drawing from it. For 3 days, I used bottled water I'd brought from town, and on the 4th day, the well water ran clear again. But the tests continued. On a night in early November, I woke to find symbols drawn in ash on the outside of every window. The same symbols that marked Marcus's burned flesh. They hadn't been there when I'd locked up the house at sunset, and they couldn't have been drawn without someone physically placing them. Yet, no footprints marked the ground beneath the windows. No ladder leaned against the house. The symbols had simply appeared, a message from the harvester that the rules protected me but did not make me invulnerable. I spent the morning cleaning away the ash and reinforcing the house's protections, sprinkling salt along every windowsill and doorway, hanging iron horseshoes, which I found in abundance in the barn. The iron seemed to help. That night, the harvester appeared as usual, but made no attempt to approach closer than its customary distance. November brought the first serious cold, and with it, a new concern. My savings from my software career would last perhaps 6 months if I was careful, but the farm wasn't generating income. The corn harvest had been sold, but the profit was minimal, barely enough to cover property taxes. I would need to find some way to support myself. I chose the latter, setting up a freelance web development business that I could manage from Marcus's laptop. The internet connection was terrible. Satellite with frustrating latency, but it was workable. I took on small projects, enough to pay for food, utilities, and the various supplies the binding required. It was a strange double life, spending my days writing code and attending video calls with clients who had no idea their developer was working from a demon-haunted farm, then spending my evenings performing arcane rituals and watching for supernatural threats. Winter deepened, and the property transformed. Snow covered the harvested cornfield, accumulating in drifts against the barn and house. The forest pressed closer in the darkness, and the harvester's appearances became more frequent. The barn became a source of particular concern. Despite the sealed east door, I sometimes heard breathing sounds from within, slow and deep. The temperature around the barn's eastern wall was noticeably colder than the rest of the structure, cold enough that frost formed on the wood, even when the rest of the barn remained dry. The journals suggested it was drawn to the binding's energy, feeding on the mystical forces that kept the harvester contained. As long as the east door remained sealed, it would remain dormant. But Rule 3 was explicit. The seal could not be broken until the spring equinox. Breaking it during the winter months would release something that previous keepers had described with obvious terror. December brought the winter solstice, the longest night, when the barrier between worlds was supposedly at its thinnest. Silas's journals described elaborate rituals performed on this night, hours of chanting and offerings, designed to reinforce the weakening walls of the harvester's prison. I prepared for days, gathering the necessary materials, memorizing the words. The ritual began at sunset. I built a fire in the stone circle, larger than the monthly offerings, feeding it specific combinations of wood that Silas had specified. Oak for strength, ash for protection, thorn for binding. As the fire grew, I began the chants, speaking words that hurt my throat to pronounce. The harvester appeared almost immediately, materializing at the very edge of the stone circle, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its burning scythe. Its burlap face tilted toward me, and for the first time, I heard its voice. Not imagined or telepathic, but actual sound vibrating through the air. "New keeper," it said, the words crackling like fire-consuming dry wood. "Young and untested, the solstice weakens all bonds. Perhaps tonight the binding finally breaks." I forced myself to continue the chant, to not be drawn into conversation. Engaging with the demon was not part of the ritual. Responding to its provocations would only give it power. But the harvester persisted, circling the stone circle, looking for entry points in the ritual I was performing. "Do you know what you protect them from?" it asked. "Do you understand the harvest I would reap if freed? Not just this land, not just this valley. Fire spreads, keeper. My flames would consume until the very air ignited with my passage. You condemn me to imprisonment to save billions who will never know your name. Never thank you for your sacrifice." The words were designed to make me question, to create doubt that would weaken my resolve. I pushed through the chant, speaking louder to drown out its voice. The fire in the circle burned brighter, the blue flames reaching higher, and the harvester recoiled slightly, its confidence faltering. 7 generations their family chained me. It continued, anger creeping into its voice now. But the bloodline is broken. You are not an Ashford. You have no hereditary right to hold me. When you fail, there will be no one to take your place. That landed more effectively than its other arguments. It was right. I was not an Ashford, had no blood connection to this land or this binding. I was here through accident and Marcus's desperate choice. And when I died or finally broke under the burden, who would take my place? Would the binding even accept another non-Ashford keeper? But I had hours of ritual ahead of me, and these doubts were luxuries I couldn't afford. I focused on the words, on the rhythm of the chant. The night deepened around us. Demon and keeper, performing our ancient roles in a dance that neither of us had chosen. Around midnight, something changed. The temperature plummeted, and I saw my breath frosting in the air, despite the massive fire before me. The east side of the barn creaked and groaned, and I realized with growing horror that the thing in the loft was waking. The solstice was affecting it as well, drawing it from its hibernation. "Feel that, keeper?" the harvester asked. "My companion stirs. The binding may hold me, but it does not hold everything that has been drawn to this place. The devourer of warmth rises, and your ritual protects only against me." The barn's east door rattled in its chains, and I heard something moving inside, sliding, dragging itself toward the sealed entrance. The cold intensified until my fingers began to go numb, even though I stood next to the fire. I had a choice to make: continue the ritual and hope the barn door's seal held, or break the ritual to reinforce the door and risk weakening the binding against the harvester. I chose to trust Silas's work. The barn had been sealed with the same care and knowledge that had created the binding. If the ritual required my focus here, then the barn's protections would have to hold on their own. I continued chanting, even as the sounds from the barn grew more violent. The harvester laughed. Stubborn. Their great-great-uncle was stubborn too. Thomas Ashford, who opened that door in winter. They found him frozen with fear written in frost on his face. You could end up the same way, keeper. All it would take is one chain breaking, one seal failing. But the chains held, and as the solstice night reached its darkest hour, I completed the final words of the ritual, speaking the last binding phrases with the last of my voice. The blue flames erupted upward, forming a column of cold fire that stretched into the night sky, and I felt the binding snap tight, like a chain pulled taut. The harvester staggered backward, forced away from the stone circle by the ritual's completion. The cold from the barn lessened immediately, and the sounds of movement within ceased. Whatever had woken in the loft had been forced back into dormancy by the binding's renewal. The solstice crisis had passed. I collapsed beside the fire, exhausted beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Every muscle ached. My throat was raw from hours of chanting. Dawn came eventually, as it always does. I dragged myself back to the house, tended to my minor injuries, and slept for 16 hours straight. When I woke, I found frost patterns on every window. They formed something that might have been words of approval. The binding had accepted my efforts. The winter continued, but after the solstice, the supernatural activity lessened. I began to understand why the Ashfords had borne this burden for 7 generations. Yes, it was imprisonment of a sort, a terrible responsibility. But there was also a strange satisfaction in it. I was doing something that mattered, something vital, even if no one beyond this property would ever know. While the rest of the world slept safely in their beds, I stood guard against something that would consume them all given the chance. Spring came gradually, the snow melting to reveal the dead remnants of last year's corn and the first green shoots of new growth. The spring equinox arrived, and with it the end of Rule 3's restriction. The barn's east door could now be opened. Whatever had hibernated in the loft could emerge and depart. On the morning of the equinox, I removed the chains and iron bars, then stood well back as I pulled open the door. What emerged was difficult to describe. It had no solid form, existing more as an absence than a presence. Where it passed, frost formed on surfaces, and I felt the warmth being pulled from my body even at 10 feet distance. It flowed out of the barn like concentrated cold given motion and disappeared into the forest. The journal suggested it would return in the autumn, drawn back by the binding's energy to hibernate through another winter. For now, it was gone, and the barn could be used normally again. I spent the spring planting vegetables and other crops that would help me be more self-sufficient. The farm began to feel less like a prison and more like a home, albeit one with supernatural responsibilities. I even made a few trips to town for supplies, brief excursions that the binding allowed without protest. The locals gave me the same looks Marcus had probably received, a mixture of pity and fear, but they didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer information. Summer brought new challenges. The cornfield grew thick and green, and with it came the danger of formations. Rule 7 warned about circles appearing in the crops, patterns that weren't natural and summoned something, if left intact. I found my first circle in mid-June, a perfect ring about 15 feet in diameter where the corn stalks had been bent and woven into an intricate pattern. I burned it immediately as the rule instructed, cutting out the affected stalks and setting them ablaze. The smoke that rose from the fire was wrong, thick and greasy, with a smell like burning sulfur mixed with rotting meat. As the last of the pattern consumed, I heard laughter from deeper in the cornfield, distant and mocking. That night, the harvester appeared closer than it had since the solstice, its burning scythe casting long shadows across the porch where I sat watching. We regarded each other in silence, and I understood that we had reached an equilibrium of sorts. It would continue testing the binding, looking for weaknesses, but it also recognized that I was committed to my role as keeper. A year passed then too. I marked the time by solstices and equinoxes, by monthly offerings and daily boundary walks. My old life in Baltimore became increasingly distant, like a dream I'd once had and could barely remember. I let my apartment lease expire, had my few possessions shipped to the farm, and accepted that this was my life now. The freelance work continued to provide income, and I became more efficient at balancing my mundane and mystical responsibilities. I even began documenting my own experiences, adding to the journals that stretched back to Silas. Future keepers would read my words, just as I'd read Marcus's and the Ashfords before him. The knowledge had to be preserved, the rules had to be passed on. But the harvester's words from the solstice night haunted me. When you fail, there will be no one to take your place. It was right. I was 34 years old now, and I couldn't maintain this watch forever. Eventually, I would grow old, weak, or simply make a fatal mistake. And then what? Would the binding collapse? Would the harvester finally achieve the freedom it had sought for nearly 2 centuries? The answer came on an autumn evening in my 3rd year as keeper. I was checking the stones as I did every day when I found someone else on the property. A young woman, maybe 25, standing at the western boundary stone and examining the symbols carved into it. "You shouldn't be here," I called out, approaching cautiously. Trespassers were rare this far into the wilderness, and the binding didn't react well to unauthorized presences. She turned to face me. Her eyes held the same haunted knowledge that I'd seen in Marcus's dying gaze. "I know," she said, "but I had to come. I've been having dreams about this place for months. Dreams about a farm that needs protection, about a burden that requires bearing. And in those dreams, I see what you're doing here." I came to understand if the dreams were real. I stared at her, understanding dawning. The binding itself was seeking out a potential replacement, reaching out through dreams. The same way it had apparently guided Alice to Marcus, and Marcus to me. The cycle would continue. When I could no longer serve, there would be someone else. The watch would not end with me. "What's your name?" I asked. "Emily Chun," she replied. "I'm a graduate student in folklore, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because something in these dreams tells me this is where I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to do, even though that makes no logical sense." I looked at her for a long moment, weighing my options. I could send her away, tell her the dreams meant nothing, protect her from the burden I'd accepted. Or I could tell her the truth, show her the journals, let her make an informed choice about whether to eventually take on this responsibility. "Come to the house," I said. "I'll make coffee, and then I'll tell you everything. You deserve to know the full truth before deciding anything." We walked back to the farmhouse together, trailed by the harvester's burning gaze. I began to explain the burden that had defined my life for 3 years. She listened, asked intelligent questions, and by the time dawn broke, I knew she understood what was being offered. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is everything you said. A prison sentence, a calling, both at once. Take all the time you need," I told her. "I'm not dying tomorrow, but when the time comes, when I can't do this anymore, I need to know there will be someone to take my place." She left that morning, driving away with the journals I'd let her borrow, the full documentation of 7 generations of Ashfords plus Marcus's experiences and my own. I didn't know if she'd accept the calling or decide to ignore the dreams and live a normal life, but for the first time since becoming keeper, I felt something that might have been hope. 3 weeks later, Emily returned. She didn't say anything at first, just drove up to the house and stood on the porch, looking out at the cornfield. "I can't do it now," she said finally. "I have a dissertation to finish, a life in the city. But in a few years, when you need me, I'll come. I'll learn the rituals, take on the responsibility. The dreams won't let me make any other choice." I nodded, understanding. "That's all I can ask for. The binding will wait. It's patient." She visited occasionally after that, usually for a weekend, learning the rules and rituals, helping with the boundary walks and monthly offerings. She was being trained as I had never been, gradually prepared for the day when the burden would pass to her. I'm writing this now in my 8th year as keeper, knowing that my time is not yet done, but understanding that it's finite. Emily visits monthly now, staying longer each time, learning the deeper mysteries of the binding. Soon, perhaps in another year or 2, she'll be ready to take over fully, and I'll be able to leave this place, knowing it's in capable hands. I don't regret my choice, strange as that might sound. Yes, I gave up the life I thought I wanted, the career, urban pleasures, and possibility of normal relationships. But in return, I've done something meaningful. I've protected millions who will never know my name. The harvester still paces at the edge of the cornfield each night, its burning scythe casting shadows that dance across my porch. Somewhere, Silas Ashford is probably watching from whatever afterlife he's found, satisfied that his work continues. 7 generations of his blood maintained the binding, and now others have taken up the burden. The watch continues, as it must, as it will, because some things are worth sacrificing for. Some responsibilities must be borne no matter the cost, and some fires must never be allowed to spread. I am David Matthews, 8th keeper of Ashford Farm. The binding holds, the demon remains imprisoned, and I stand watch as I will, until the day I can pass this duty to the one who comes after me.